Coming from the world of history and antiques, I'm truly delighted to introduce these authors. Betsy Tyler, a research fellow, was the first and former Obed Macy Research Chair and editor of Historic Nantucket. Her novel, A Thousand Leagues of Blue, dives into the incredible story of Susan Veeder and her whaling husband, Charles Veeder. Her perspective as one of the first wives aboard a whale ship is very enlightening, very different than everything else in the literature that we have. I was involved in bringing the very intriguing portrait of Susan Veeder to market, and it ended up at the NHA. So I was really thrilled when Betsy dove into this and fleshed out that story. It's a fascinating story. Julie Gerstenblatt is a teacher, prolific essayist, producer, and host of A Mighty Blaze. Her first novel, The Daughters of Nantucket, is set against the Nantucket Great Fire of 1846. It's a very crucial and I think very underexplored part of Nantucket history. We all get a paragraph of it and then we go on. To see someone really dive into this again is long overdue. The fire is of particular interest to me since I'm lucky enough to be situated in one of the few buildings in town that survived the fire. Closer? Sorry, should I start from the top? Hosting this discussion today is our very own Mary Bergman of the Nantucket Book Festival, director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, author, and a presenter on WCAI's A Cape Cod Notebook. Mary.
Thank you, Jack. Well, great. All right, well, we only have one microphone that works really well. So I'm going to be giving it to these ladies right here. And as you can see, it sounds loud to us here, but that they still can't hear. So really, really close to the mouth. So I think we'll probably just pass this one back and forth. I'm not even going to try with the other microphone. Jack, thank you so much for that fabulous introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. The first question that I want to talk to or ask of Julie and Betsy is kind of how did they come to Nantucket? What was their experience of discovering the stories? Jack kind of gave you a little bit about the brief synopsis of their histories, but or their narratives. But I'd love to hear, how you came to the island and then how you discovered the story that your books are about.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for being here. And thank you to everybody at the festival and to Kaylee and Theron in memory of what she's done to bring us all together. I am delighted to be here. I also really want to thank Mariah Mitchell, who was on the stage and is around. There she is, a bust of her. And also, of course, Mary and Betsy. So I first started coming to Nantucket in the summer of 1978. My family rented a house on Pulpus Road, and it was an idyllic 2 weeks. The grandparents, the dogs, the station wagon, the cousins, and a lot of time spent on beaches and bonding, and I just fell in love with the place. I did not really care too much about the history of the island, sorry to say. I liked it as a vacation spot and then grew to bring my family, my husband and children, and we still come for a few weeks every summer, but I didn't spend a lot of time in the museum, and I'm not a huge history buff. I am a writer, and I started writing contemporary novels that did not sell. I could get an agent, but I couldn't sell a story. And then I came across The Great Fire in Nat Philbrick's History of the Island, and it's that short, just 2 paragraphs, and I was hooked. I could smell it. I could feel it. I could see Main Street burning before my eyes. And so it's because it's Nantucket that I had to tell this story. And now suddenly I'm going to write historical novels for the rest of my life because I love it. But it took Nantucket to connect me to that.
Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to thank the Book Festival for having me back, particularly Theron Dunn, who was my champion and neighbor and friend, and I'll miss her forever. I came to Nantucket in 1981 in January when the harbor was frozen and a Coast Guard cutter had to cut a path, a channel, so the steamship could come in. And I stood on the deck wondering what in hell I had done. But I had come following the love of my life and have been here for 42 years and love every moment of it, particularly the off-season. And I was introduced to Nantucket history early on because I knew nothing about it except from having read Moby Dick in college. And even then, Nantucket seemed like a mystical place, not somewhere you could actually go. But I remember Edward Stackpole was giving his winter lectures about Nantucket history, and I went to a couple of them and was completely lost because he connected everybody with every house, with every event, in no particular order, and I was completely mystified by this place. But I am a librarian by profession, and I was lucky enough to be hired by the Historical Association as their librarian back in 1992 or somewhere. And I just started reading about Nantucket history and working with researchers who came to the library, and particularly with Nat Philbrick, who had come here about the same time and was beginning to write about Nantucket history and delving into every research collection we had. So that's how I got my foot in the water, so to speak.
Thank you. So you just mentioned that you've been helping research. So you two have met before. Can you tell us a little bit, Julie, about coming to Nantucket to do research as somebody who is not a historian, kind of how you got into the history side of the novel?
Yeah, when my agent said to me, I think you should write that Nantucket book, and I was like, oh no, that's not my thing. I remembered that I'd written a dissertation and spent 10 years doing research. So then I was like, actually, maybe that can be my thing, and I can do research, and I'm not afraid of it, and I really like that deep dive. But with this, I had to figure out where to start, and I started with Betsy Tyler. So I came to the island with my husband for a long weekend in May, right before Memorial Day weekend. Half the things were still closed, like Hadwin House. I was like, oh, didn't know that. But Betsy agreed to meet with me and talk to me about the fire and town at the time and just give me answers to questions that I had started to figure out. I wrote 40 pages before coming here. This was May of 2019. And those were the hardest 40 pages I've ever written in my life. I love to write, but I had to figure out how to tell a story that was historical but didn't feel old-fashioned or boring or dull, and what was the voice for that. And also things like, were there street lamps? And, there were so many practical things that I didn't know. And so meeting with Betsy at the corner table is just a memory of really committing to this and feeling like, and she was like, you can do this, and I'm here, and we have others who know the things that you need to know. And so Barbara White is also here. Barbara, I spoke to her several times and read her book, A Line in the Sand, if you haven't read it, about integration of schools and the fight in particular from the 1840 to 47 roughly, and so many other people. But it really started with Betsy and her own research.
Yeah. And then Betsy, in telling the story of Susan and Charles Veeder, you took a few research trips yourself that took us pretty far from Nantucket. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I took one research trip to New Bedford, which was not too far.
Another world.
I went there also.
Yeah. Did some work there. But as I was thinking of writing this book about a woman who went to sea with her husband and spent a lot of time in the area between Tahiti and the Marquesas, which is also where her husband went 20 years later and never came home, I thought, I really need to see that part of the world. I've never been on a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. What's it like? What's it like to see an atoll in the distance, or, to feel the swell of the ocean rocking a ship? So I found, luckily, this passenger freighter ship called the Aranui, which sails every 2 weeks from Tahiti to the Marquesas, delivering all kinds of supplies to the islands. And it stops at 2 of the Tuamotus in the Tuamotu archipelago, and then it stops at all 6 inhabited Marquesas islands to deliver goods and to take on copra, which is the product of the islands. So I said to my husband, I need to go on this trip. And he said, sure, let's go. So it was amazing. It was, it wasn't your typical research trip, but I needed to have a feel of being in the area where these people spent so much time. And it was well worth it. And I highly recommend this to anybody who wants to see that part of the world. It's quite something. I did try to do some research in the archives in Tahiti, in Papeete, for a day. I'd hired a translator because it was all in French, and my French is really not there. And I didn't get anywhere, unfortunately. I was trying to find out where Charles Veeder died in this area and when, and I still don't know for sure. But the trip was amazing, and yeah, I recommend it.
And I recommend Nantucket.
I would like to go on Betsy's trip. I think, Julie, you kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I wanted to get into, Julie wrote a novel, and Betsy's work is a work of nonfiction, and the differences between the two. So maybe Julie, or Betsy, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the challenges of creating a compelling narrative when you didn't necessarily know all, like you say, you just didn't know where Charles ended up dying, and how do you fill in these holes? We'll start there.
Well, luckily, I had 2 really great sources of information for this book. 2 journals that record 2 voyages. The first took place in 1848 when Susan Veeder went on the Nauticon with her husband, Captain Charles Veeder, and 2 of their children. And she kept this beautifully illustrated journal of her trip. She calls it Islands Seen by the Ship Nauticon. And she painted these watercolor illustrations, full-page color illustrations of places that she saw from the ship or where she went ashore. And the journal is amazing. I could go into a little background about that. It came up for auction in 1995. It had been in private hands when I was working at the Historical Association. And everybody knew that the journal belonged here on Nantucket. So the Friends of the Historical Association came up with a $10,000 purse to bid at auction for this journal. And they asked me to come in on a Saturday and bid by phone, which was a terrifying thing to ask somebody to try to get this journal. And so I did that. Luckily, it was an old rotary phone. The phone line was good. And we got the journal, and it arrived here. And I remember opening it up and being just immediately struck by the fact that I'm holding this artifact that had been on a voyage itself. And it had been written in by this woman I was so very much interested in. it's a very powerful thing to work with original material like that. And so I was lucky to have this journal, which really told a narrative itself. So that was my primary source. And then after I was writing about Susan, I wanted to know more about her husband, Charles. And I started a very simple process of looking for his death date. That seemed like an easy thing to find, but I couldn't find it anywhere. It's like, why is there no obituary of this successful whaling captain in the local paper? And why is his death date so hard to pin down? I started looking through town death records, and then I found that he died in 1878. There's no death date, just his name. It says Charles Veeder, Society Islands, 1878. So I thought, well, he was on a voyage and he was older and got sick and died. So I thought, well, there must be, obviously I could easily find out what ship he was on. There's huge compendia of whaling voyages. It's easy to find that kind of information. So I found that his last ship was the William Gifford out of New Bedford. So maybe there was a journal of that voyage. We didn't have it here in Nantucket, but I called New Bedford Research Library at their whaling museum. And they said, yes, we have this journal. It's of the last year of this voyage. And I said, well, can you just go to the end of the journal and tell me what happened to the captain? Because he didn't come home with the ship. And so the librarian called me back and said, you've got to read this. So she sent me the microfilm of the journal, and I put it on the old microfilm machine, which if you've ever read microfilm is not fun. It's all in black and white, and you crank it. And I was in the little microfilm reading room going, oh my God, I can't believe this. It's a scandalous account of the disintegration of this man, and it pretty much explained why he didn't come home. So I had these two journals that were both great stories. It was a matter of figuring out how to connect them and how to tell the story of this family that was really chewed up and spitting out by the whaling industry. 2 of their sons died at sea, their daughter died at sea. It was just, there's so much tragedy involved with these ordinary maritime Nantucket families. I'm sure this is not the only story. I would hope to find more. But those 2 journals got me started, and they provided a narrative. Each one of them had its own narrative arc, and then hopefully I've connected the 2 well enough to move the story along.
Thank you. So, Julie, I'd like to hear a little bit about the benefits of creating your own world in fiction. You use some historical figures, Maria Mitchell among them. Nantucket's a real place, of course. We're here. The Great Fire really did happen. But you delve in and create, really deep inner worlds of these 3 main characters who the narrative is told by. So if you could tell us a little bit about what are the challenges of using real people, and what's the benefit of creating your own world?
It was really fun. I have to say, I think fiction is fun, and whenever I got too stuck on something, I reminded myself I was writing fiction. But that being said, I can't just make things up. I had to stick to a lot of truth and embellish in places where it felt possible, realistic. So, for example, 3 main characters, 2 of them are my fiction completely. I started this thinking of Eliza Macy, a whaling captain's wife who's been alone for many years, and I picked a sort of space where her house would be on Upper Main Street, and I imagined this relationship with this man, and gave her a whole backstory, and she's sort of lonely and desperate when the book opens. She's not very likable, she's not her best self, And then I thought, okay, well, who would be an interesting counterpoint to this very traditional married sea captain's wife? And the natural person to, and especially connected to the fire in that timeline, was Maria Mitchell. And I was like, oh no, I don't want to use a real person. That's not as much fun. But because I can't, make up all of the things. But I was able to, in part, because when I spoke to Jason Finger, who's the head of the Maria Mitchell Association, without giving away a spoiler in the plot, something did happen in Mariah's life at that time that leaves a gap in her history, which gave me room to do pretty much whatever I wanted within reason to figure out what was she thinking at the time, who was she in love with, what was happening in her world. So she, as you probably all know, she was America's first professional female librarian. She was America's first female professional astronomer. She's a woman of science. She's independent, never married, raised in the Quaker faith and tradition to be outspoken and educated as a woman. And so the relationship between my fictional character of Eliza and Mariah could be fun. And so that was great for me. In terms of, and I want to talk about Meg for a second, but in terms of Mariah, I had coffee with Nancy Thayer last summer. Actually, we had a drink. I'll just tell you, we had a drink. We met for a drink at the Faraway, and she was like, she read it when it was first in galley form, and she provided a blurb, which was lovely, and she's been in really great support to me. And she was like, I think I know of like 9 women who are going to be mad at you about Mariah, because she is so beloved and because she is such an important figure here on Nantucket. And it was kind of like, why would I mess with that? There's danger in that, in a way. And so I wanted to be faithful and honor like all the best parts of Mariah, but I have to tell you, I've been coming to the Athenaeum forever, and you look at that portrait of her in the downstairs hall, and she doesn't really look like a lot of fun. Right? You're not like, Mariah, let's go to the Faraway for a drink. So I had to shake off that, and I had to take her out of the painting and make her three-dimensional and real and have thoughts and desires. And so one of the things that I really wrestled with was it possible? What was her sexuality? Because she never married, and there's no record of her ever being in love or mentioning anything like that, which from our perspective might mean that there was something to hide. And I'm not outing Maria Mitchell, but I am creating in my fictionalized Mariah the possibility that somebody on Nantucket in 1846 was gay. And why not give that to one of my characters? So the last thing I'll say about that was I really struggled with it. I was very nervous about it. I talked to my writing group about it. And this was during, like, I'll call it high COVID, and everybody was home. And so my family heard me talking about this a lot, and I workshopped it with my book group, and they gave me sort of like the thumbs up on the pages, and they loved it. And then my daughter came out to me and said she felt like safe and seen. And then I was like, okay, my Mariah is definitely gay. Any doubt I had about what I was doing with that character disappeared. My third character is Meg Wright. I realized that in my research that there was a thriving Black community on the island. I felt terrible for not knowing that earlier. I felt it was in some way my responsibility and duty to share that, and if I left it out, I'd be ignoring that history. But as a white woman, I was nervous about that too. Talked to my book group, talked to my daughter, talked to everybody, and decided that this was an important storyline to tell from a point of view character. So there is a racial tension, there is bigotry, there's a lot going on, and because the schools were, during that time, there was a year of integration and segregation of the schools. Nantucket was, I think, 10 years before mainland Massachusetts abolished slavery, but did not integrate the schools until many years after mainland Massachusetts did it. And so there's questions there, and I wanted to explore them, and I realized it was metaphorical fire. And so if I could have Mariah and Lindley's passionate fire, and if I could have Meg Wright and racism as a fire, and then I could actually set the place on fire for real, I was on to something, and I felt like I had the plot, and I could put the true and the imagined together. And my agent at the time said, I'll see you in 3 to 5 years. That's how long it'll take as a historical author. And I wrote it in 2 because I was on fire.
Very good. I think, I work a lot with Betsy at the Preservation Trust, doing a lot of research of houses, and any feeling that you have ever had as a person in the present day, the people in the past had too. And I think that's what I love so much about Betsy's book and Julie's books, is that they kind of, peel back the curtain. Yes, Mariah Mitchell, I agree. We see these paintings of people, and I always think, God, I'd hate it if the only picture taken of me was taken on like the worst day of my life, and I had to sit still, and we look at these people and we think, who were they? And I know you, so both of these books, I think you're right to delve into that human emotion and really show us who these people were in the past. And, maybe, who knows what Mariah's feelings were, but you're right, somebody did have those feelings. We've always been here. So I wanted to ask, let's see, as we're kind of running down, we'll be switching over to some audience questions. Why is it Nantucket? Why do you think, there's a lot of books written about Nantucket. This is the Nantucket Book Festival, not the Nantucket Book Festival, but we could have a Nantucket Book Festival. There's tons of books. What is it about Nantucket? And do you think, this is kind of a leading question, but do you think that the past is closer here? You've lived other places, you've been other places. Do you feel it when you walk around?
Yeah. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina, too, and that's another place that's just so full of ghosts. But here, I think my work with Mary and the Preservation Trust, writing histories of houses, and those histories are based on the families who lived in the houses. It's like a history of who built it and who lived there and the next folks through the generations. I start to get a sense of family connection and neighborhoods, and I can walk down a street and have an idea of who lived where in the 1830s and who's visiting whom across the street. And it still looks pretty much, it's probably a lot cleaner than it was in the 1830s, but there's a real sense of living in the past here, and I love that. I love that about this place. I felt at home even when I first stepped off that steamship in 1981, when everything was frozen solid. It felt like a place that beckoned me, to stay. And I love learning more about it. Nantucket's so rich, and there's such great material here that's still been unmined. The Historical Association's research library is a treasure trove, and if you've never looked at their website, a lot's been digitized. You can actually read Susan Viter's log online. It's there. They've digitized all their logbooks and a lot of other materials, so you can it's better if you can get your real hands on things. It's a different feeling, but the material's out there, and it's everywhere you walk around town too. We're sitting here in the Athenaeum in such an amazing hallowed space, and it's built on what used to be wetlands in an area called Boco Chico. It's just filled land here, and there's been a lot of, well, there's just been so much change to the landscape as well as the culture of the island, but it's all fascinating. And I'm so glad you're all here, because I can tell you appreciate it.
For me, as a non-historian, I was like, it's not going to be hard for me to imagine Nantucket in 1846, because as much as Main Street had to be rebuilt after the fire, it's pretty much the same, and the footprint is the same. And so I have the Jenks map from like 1858, and I have the fire, the burnt district map. I have a lot of maps that I just keep unrolling and looking at. But the streets were the same, many of the houses are the same, so it was so easy for me to bring it to life. You step off the ferry and you do feel like you've gone back in time. And part of that has to do with the preservation of homes, what they look like. I'm so mad. I have a friend who bought a house in Sconset, and I had to point out to her that they had to be, gray shingled and white, like white trim. She was like, oh, I was like, you don't deserve that house if you don't know that. So how come I'm still the day tripper here in this scenario? No, so so it does feel historic here. Also, what makes Nantucket an interesting setting is it's an island 30 miles out to sea. And what that means for me in my novel was news travels slow. You can do, like Jenks really did say, you can't tell us what to do, mainland Massachusetts. And it's still true. And there's something about this island of cousins, 10 original families, the Macy's Coffin, Starbucks, all of the marriages, all of the family, and these town hall meetings that are still contentious and still passionate about the smallest things, from the Nantucket sign last summer. Oh yeah, I read the Current like some people read the Times. I mean, I get that, and I'm like, cover to cover. The plastic flowers, no, not okay. On, somebody on the Abigail Fox's sign. People care about the look and feel. They feel really invested in so much. And of course, the big things, which if I say STR, like you care about who gets to be here for how long, there's a control issue, because we love it, but also because we're far away. And I say we, like I live here, but the island thing is really interesting to me.
I think we could agree that Julie gets to be an honorary Nantucketer at this point. Yeah, absolutely. We'll vote you in at the next town meeting. It does take a lot of work to keep the island feeling the way that it did, and it is changing, but it's, every place is changing. Real quick, I'd love to hear just what you're working on next. Sorry, Betsy.
Okay. So there's an expression in writing called killing your darlings. It means that you can't include everything you want in your book, or, sometimes in my case and in a lot of other people's cases, it's a character that has to go. It's just not serving the novel. I sometimes have like a best friend, like a mother and a neighbor who gives advice. Combine them into one and give that character more power. So I had to cut one of Eliza Macy's friends named Nell Starbuck, and I loved Nell Starbuck. So there's now one sentence in the book early on that says Eliza Macy has grown closer with Maria Mitchell ever since her best friend Nell Starbuck left with her merchant husband on a global shopping spree sort of thing. So that's book 2. I imagine it begins 5 years after the fire. You will see, and Nell lives in the blue house with the cupola just on Upper Main. Yeah, which I got to see last summer inside for the House and Garden tour. Yeah, and then I got in trouble for taking pictures. Okay, but I pretended to delete them, but I still have them. And so the dining room has handmade wallpaper of Canton and the harbor and ships. And I was like, perfect, because this is going to be Nell's house. She and Peter Starbuck and their daughter Winifred will pack up. You will see Eliza Macy. You will learn some things from the end of the first book. If you have questions about how it ends, you'll get some answers. And then off we go around Cape Horn to San Francisco at the height of the gold rush, and on to China where calamity ensues. Because I've since learned that I like to write action and adventure. And if you've read the novel, and like little Joseph Allen, who works at the Athenaeum, he's all grown up. He's in San Francisco. He had a shipwreck out there in the Bay of San Francisco, and they pick him up and take him along, and he'll be one of the point of view characters.
That sounds good. I'm not working on another book-length thing right now. I would love to find another nugget of good historical source material. So if anybody has anything they want to share, I'm ready to read it. I do a lot of work writing about houses, as Mary mentioned, and that's constant. And it's always fascinating. Keeps me busy. I work for the Preservation Trust on contract book deals. And I also work with my friend, the architect Marcia Fader, doing historical and architectural reports on Sconset houses for the Sconset Trust. So I'm digging into a lot of original material and early deeds and trying to bust some myths, which is really challenging here. And that's always fun, putting together puzzles and untangling knots, yeah.
Oh, and then the last thing I would say about that is I'm reading Betsy's book as part of my research. So just like last time I started with Betsy, again I'm starting with Betsy, because even though the Verdiers were during the whaling time and I'm on a merchant ship, just what life was like at sea, and also from a woman's point of view, that's been helpful to me.
Well, great. So if anybody has a historic house that they would love to hire Betsy to write a history of, you can just call me at 508-228-1387 and we can contract that. We've got a few minutes for audience questions. Does anybody have a question? Okay, right there. I'm gonna keep it with you.
Oh yeah, because I'm gonna.
I'll bring this one. Yeah, you just talk real close to this mic.
All right. My question is about the research for Maria Mitchell's compatriot, so to speak. Did you require any research into Anna Gardner, who wrote Disturber of Tradition, and what impact did she have on your book?
Yeah, I did read about Anna Gardner and decided there was too much for me to also include her. So she sort of shows up at the town hall meeting. She's there, and she serves as one of Meg's tutors to help her prepare for the entrance exam for the high school, which she passes, but she's not allowed in because of the color of her skin. But I really kept her as a side character. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I think will surprise people. I'm fairly new to the island, but my husband and I are from the East Coast. However, we've been in Amarillo, Texas, on the high plains for 25 years, always knowing we wanted to retire back this way. On one of my frequent trips here, because we bought a house, waited on furniture, I got in an Uber to go to the airport in Amarillo at 4 o'clock in the morning. And the woman who picked me up, and a lot of times I don't even talk, she said, "Oh, so where are you going?" And I said, "Well, Dallas, Boston, then I'm catching a bus and a ferry." And so I said, "Nantucket." She was probably in her late 30s, early 40s. In the middle of nowhere, she starts giving me an encyclopedic history of the families of Nantucket. She was totally into genealogy and had followed her mother or mother-in-law's relatives, tracing them back. And in the 20-minute ride to the airport, I learned so much, and who was married to who, and who was a cousin, and why. But it's also just great that I'm here listening to you, because she gave me her website, which I have to admit I haven't gone back to look, but I want to buy your book, and I'll call her and give her, I'm trying to sell the house in Texas, so I'm making a brief trip back, but she would love to read about this. So you never know how far and wide your material will enrich somebody's life.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. It does make me think of, I got a phone call early on in my book tour. I was headed to Beacon Hill Books for an event, and they had flown in Nantucket Bay scallops. It was like very fancy. My mom and I were staying in Boston Park Plaza and getting ready, like I curled my hair and everything. And the phone rings, and it's a Westchester number. I was doing an event next in Westchester, so I answered. And this guy's like, "Hi, are you Julie Gerstenblatt? I found you on the internet." And I was like, this is going to be bad. But it turns out that after a minute, he said, "I'm related to Eliza Macy. And my family wants to know if your Eliza Macy is our Eliza Macy." And so I said, "No," and he said, "We didn't think so. Eliza Macy had sons, one of whom is R.A.H. Macy from Macy's department store," and on and on. But Macy's have been coming out of the woodwork to talk to me. I have been invited to Minnesota to see a family tree and genealogy. Anytime I'm in the greater Minnesota area, I should stop by. So yeah, it is alive for a lot of people, that genealogy.
Yeah, I think that Nantucket has a very compelling reach, and anyway, we're just so happy that you're all here with us today. A big round of applause for Betsy and Julie.